Ignatius Press and the Augustine Institute present the Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers unpacking good books, chapter by chapter. If you like us, please help us by subscribing and by reviewing us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you might listen. And don't forget to sign up for weekly updates and study questions at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.
Welcome to the Formed Book Club, where we continue to discuss Joseph Ratzinger's The Spirit of the Liturgy. I'm Father Fessio of Ignatius Press. This is Vivian Dudro, also of Ignatius Press. Joseph Pearce, our comrade in arms there. We are now on Chapter 4, Part 2. Joseph Ratzinger was a great teacher, and it showed in his writings, both as Pope and as an author. And he's also very organized. So we're on Part 2. Part 1, to remind you, is on the essence of the liturgy. It always begins with things which are fundamental. The essence, talk about liturgy, how it is part of life, the church's life and our life. Liturgy, cosmos, and history. That theme we'll see again in these chapters. Keeps coming up that the liturgy inserts us into history, salvation history and incarnation and the resurrection of Christ and crucifixion, but it also inserts us into the cosmos, which was created for its return to God. And then the third chapter is from Old Testament and New. He's always showing the continuity in Revelation between the Old Testament and the New. Now on Part 2, time and space. Well, the cosmos is what is time and space. Space-time, it's called, But inside that space-time cosmos, there's also human history. So he's going to talk about, we've discussed already, liturgy related to time and space. We've talked about sacred places, the church, and then the altar. Now we're going to come to the reservation of the Blessed Sacrament, and this was a kind of neuralgic issue for some time. It may still be. Many churches now have restored the tabernacle to the center as opposed to putting it on the side or in another chapel or even sometimes another building. And he here is giving his reasons why it should be the center of the church. So, on page 99 of your one version, the new version, my page 85, he begins, first sentence, the church of the first millennium knew nothing of tabernacles. So he accepts the argument of those who oppose having the Blessed Sacrament reserved or having adoration, holy hours, and so on. He says, yes, you're right. For 1,000 years, we didn't have tabernacles. Down 10 lines. The tabernacle as sacred tent, this is in the Old Testament, as place of the Shekinah, the presence, the glory of the living God, developed in the second millennium. He refers to, if you like, to the decadence theory. So the theory is that, we never had a tabernacle, but of course, in the Middle Ages, we had all these accretions, and we lost primitive purity and simplicity, and so the church became liturgically decadent. Again, he will address face on the harshest criticisms. Following page, towards the bottom there, he references an important finding of Henri de Lubac, which is often misunderstood. I want to read this little section at the bottom because it's beautiful. This is a book by de Lubac called Corpus Mysticum, the mystical body. And of course, what do we think of today when we think of mystical body? The church, right? And what do we think of when we talk about the real presence of the true body of Christ? We think of the Eucharist, right? Well, de Lubac went back into the history of the church and the fathers and the doctors of the church and found out they had just the reverse view. Listen to this. About the twin components of corpus mysticum, that is mystical body, and corpus verum, true body. In the vocabulary of the fathers, mysticum did not mean mystical in the modern sense, but rather pertaining to the mystery, the spirit of the sacrament. By the way, the Greek word mysterion which we translate as mystery, is Latinized as sacramentum. Thus, the phrase corpus mysticum was used to express the sacramental body, that is the Eucharist, the corporeal presence of Christ in the sacrament. According to the Fathers, that body is given to us so that we may become the corpus verum, the real body of Christ, that is the church. Changes in the use of language and the forms of thought resulted in the reversal of these meanings. The sacrament was now addressed as the corpus verum, the true body, while the church was called the corpus mysticum, the mystical body. Mystical here meaning no longer sacrament, but mysterious. The important thing, though, is that in a sense they're interchangeable. It is one body. The sacrament of Christ and the Eucharist and the church, that's the same body. And jump in anytime you want. I'm going to try and kind of give an overview of the chapter by quoting some of the key passages. Page 102 or 88, bottom of that paragraph at the top. Only the true body in the sacrament can build up the true body of the new city of God. This insight connects the two periods and provides our starting point. So he's going to show the relationship of the true body and the mystical body, Eucharist and church. Just below the middle of the page there, and he's going to go into the criticism that arose during the liturgical movement. In the early days of the liturgical movement, people sometimes argued for a distinction between the thing-centered view of the Eucharist in the patristic age and the personalistic view of the post-medieval period. The Eucharistic presence, they said, was understood not as the presence of a person, but as the presence of a gift distinct from the person. What does he say to that? The mild-mannered Joseph Ratzinger. This is nonsense. Anyone reading the text will find there's no support anywhere for these ideas. So he cuts that one off at the knees. Next page, above the middle, he's describing what actually happens. What happens in the Middle Ages is not a misunderstanding due to losing sight of what is central, but a new dimension of the reality of Christianity opening up through the experience of the saints, supported and illuminated by the reflection of the theologians. And this is an expression of how he views development and history of the church. Yes, there are creases. Yes, there are mistakes. Yes, there are cultural additions that can be removed. But by and large, what is happening is new dimensions are opened up through what? Through the saints, first of all, and then the reflection of the theologians. Continuing Ratzinger here. At the same time, this new development is in complete continuity with what had always been believed hitherto. Let me say it again, says Ratzinger. This deepened awareness of faith is impelled by the knowledge that in the consecrated species, he, emphasized, is there and remains there. When a man experiences this with every fiber of his heart and mind and senses, the consequence is inescapable. We must make a proper place for this presence. And so little by little, the tabernacle takes shape. And more, always in a spontaneous way, it takes the place previously occupied by the now disappeared Ark of the Covenant. What a beautiful expression that is of the life of the church.
A couple of things, Father, on that, if I may. Both of you can yawn ostentatiously, because obviously we've been doing this now for a few years, and you know, I'm sure I'm repeating. In fact, I know I'm repeating myself. But when on the first page, when he talked about the decadence theory, I've never heard it called that before. But the canonization of the early days and romanticism about the first century, I thought about this metaphor I brought many times about Tolkien talking about the early church as the sapling, and the church today is the full-grown tree, and you can't chop down the tree looking for the sapling, the so-called purity of the early church. So this canonization of the early days and romanticism about the first century as being something which misunderstands the continuum which the church is. And of course, he used the metaphor of a tree, but what Ratzinger's doing here is using the metaphor of a person, of course, the person of Jesus Christ. And when I was undergoing instruction to be received into the church, and I was saying to the priest, you know, I wanted solid truth. I didn't want any sort of modernism. And I think the church is a rock, you know, it's unchanging. And this holy priest, and is a holy priest, Benedictine. He said, yes, that's true. The church is a rock. The church is also a pilgrim. And so that threw me, because it hit me with a sort of something which is paradoxical. It's both a rock and a pilgrim, something which is unchanging, something which nonetheless moves. But it moves, of course, without changing in the essence, because it's the same person. The pilgrim is the same person moving through the two millennia. So that made my rather static metaphor of the rock dynamic, and it was, you know, very important to me. And I think that's what's happening here in that use of those images.
Well, what's interesting here, too, as far as movement, there's a going forward in order to go back. In other words, I always assumed that this tabernacle and all that had something to do with the Old Testament. And then it turns out, reading Ratzinger, that this development of understanding happened much later, that it wasn't like a direct continuum from Israel to the church and now to our time, that there was a time where this was not seen the way it is now, this connection. And that was what was so surprising to me.
Yeah, but he does connect the tabernacle with the Ark of the Covenant. So
Yes.
there is also, yeah, there's both. Like you say, there's this rock and this pilgrim.
Right, but the pilgrim didn't just make a straight line from the tabernacle of the Old Testament to the tabernacle of the New Testament. There was a time when there was no tabernacle, and then when it was understood in the Middle Ages, it's interesting that he relates this somehow to the Franciscans. He doesn't really say what the connection is. Maybe you know, Father, what the connection with the Franciscans is, but nevertheless, that now this is, oh, yes, and that's right. There was a tabernacle, an Ark and a Covenant, and all the rest of it.
With the Franciscans and the Dominicans. But yeah,
Order of preachers, yes.
Better than I could. But actually, that first paragraph of the chapter, it's not that the tabernacle emerges from nothing. It's taking the place, or it emerges from the Ciborium and the Baldacchino, which was in the place of the Shekinah, which I'm sure I'm pronouncing incorrectly, which does connect, if I understand it correctly, to the Ark of the Covenant. So
yes, I don't think you're understanding my point exactly, because what I'm saying is that I always assumed that there was a direct line, that there always were tabernacles in churches because of the Old Testament practice. What I didn't realize was that the tabernacle in the church was a later development, but then they connected it to the earlier practice. Do you see? There was a time when there was not a direct step-by-step from tabernacle to tabernacle.
Except, you're both right here in the sense that what he says here, the first page, is that in the early church, the altar itself with this baldacchino was considered the tabernacle. That was the tent of God's presence. But that was only there as Mass is being celebrated. They would reserve the Blessed Sacrament back in the sacristy somewhere in a box or in a cabinet or whatever. But they didn't have a tabernacle as we know it as part of the church structure. But they did have something which was a continuation of the Ark of the Covenant,
right?
Namely the church itself and the sanctuary.
Right. Because didn't the Ark of the Covenant have in it some of the manna from the desert?
It also had
the Ten Commandments.
The Ten Commandments, yeah.
The Ten Commandments and the manna. Yeah. And so, I don't know, it's just interesting how these symbols, it's not like it's just a direct point by point by point by point that happens through time. It's kind of, well, what do pilgrims do, Joseph? They don't just take the most direct route necessarily. They're kind of, meandering and wandering, and I don't know.
But I want to, I agree with what you're saying, but I also want to make sure we don't lead people into this idea that, real organic growth can be going back and picking up something which was just, not useful and bringing it back. For example, the second canon.
He says right here that this new development is in complete continuity with what had always been believed. So I would not want to suggest that this was, I don't know, like you say, a going backwards and picking up something. It's in complete continuity. But I'm just saying, I just always assumed there always was a tabernacle in a Christian church.
So the tabernacle's not an innovation, but but the point is the thing which we see physically and manifest as a tabernacle on the altar.
Yes.
Thanks be to God, now back on the altar, at least at the center of the sanctuary. That was not part of the church, that particular physical thing, but something which
Yes.
represented the tabernacle, which itself represented the Ark of the Covenant, had always been manifest in some sense, but not in the sense of what is we now recognize as a physical tabernacle.
Thank you. I think that clarifies it beautifully.
Yes. So it wasn't a break. It
No.
wasn't a leap, but it also wasn't continuous in the same form.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I think we all understand each other now. Thank
All
you.
right, that's good.
If I could be pedantic, I'm sorry. It is continuous in the same form. It's not in the same accidentals.
Oh,
Yeah.
the essence was always there.
Yeah, exactly. That's the whole point, right?
That
But the
essence was
accidental
always
manifestation changes.
Yes. Yes.
We're going on to page 104 or 90. New paragraph there. So let no one say, quote, Eucharist is for eating, not looking at, unquote. And that was quite common to hear that said.
Oh my gosh, it was said after a Sunday Mass here in my parish in San Francisco. The pastor got up and literally in this booming voice said, the Eucharist is food and not something to be adored. And
Did you shoot him?
No, but my older son, who was old enough to understand at the time, he yanked my skirt and he said, Mommy, is the priest right? And of course, I wasn't going to say the priest was wrong. So I just said, let's go home and look at the catechism and see what it is he's saying or not saying. And that's exactly what we did. So I didn't have to but no, he said those exact words to an entire congregation of people.
And what does Ratzinger say in response? It is not, quote, ordinary bread, unquote, as the most ancient traditions constantly emphasize. Eating it, as we've just said, is a spiritual process involving the whole man. Eating it means worshiping it, skipping up the lines. Thus, adoration is not opposed to communion, nor is it merely added to it. No, communion only reaches its true depths when it is supported and surrounded by adoration. The Eucharistic presence in the tabernacle does not set another view of the Eucharist alongside or against the Eucharistic celebration, but simply signifies its complete fulfillment. So he's really a reconciler and a master of unity here. He's very strong when he rejects this dichotomy they're trying to set up in favor of what? In favor of recognizing the richness of the symbols, the richness of the liturgy that unites these things. And then, of course, I hear a personal echo here when he said on page 103, I recorded it, when a man experiences this that Christ is there with every fiber of his heart and mind and senses. Well, who's that man? That man is you, Carmen Ratzinger, for sure. And here at the bottom of page 104/90, 10 lines up, he says, a church without Eucharistic presence is somehow dead, even when it invites people to pray. But a church in which the eternal light is burning before the tabernacle is always alive. It's always something more than a building made of stones. In this place, the Lord is always waiting for me, calling me, wanting to make me, quote, Eucharistic. What does that mean? It means thankful, but it also means sharing oneself. As Christ shares himself with us, we participate in his love and we share ourselves with others. In this way, he prepares me for the Eucharist, sets me in motion towards his return.
And I'm sure, Joseph, you probably had similar experiences being were you always Catholic, but you came back, or did you enter the church from the outside?
I was very anti-Catholic.
That's what I thought. So, but in any case, entering the church from the outside, I mean, I could tell instantly when I was in a Catholic church that there was something different about the Catholic church. There was someone home, and I started looking for this light and realizing that it signified something alive, something waiting for me, something wanting me. I mean, that was before I knew anything about the doctrine of the real presence.
Yeah, when I was a child, and I mean a child, I'm guessing about 9 years old. There was a girlfriend, obviously not a girlfriend, you're 9 years old, a friend who was a girl. Her name was Caroline, and she went through a phase of wanting to be a Catholic. Who knows why or how, and I don't know what came of it. But she took me into the local Catholic church in the small market town in England where I was living. And so the first time I'd ever been into a Catholic church, and it stuck with me forever. I went in there, I felt as if I'd walked through a wardrobe into a place of magic. Now,
Yes.
I suppose I could be mundane about it and say, well, it was because they're unlike the Anglican churches I've been in, which have been basically largely stripped bare, so they're beautiful on the outside because they were built in the Middle Ages, but inside they're very, they look like museums. This was a living place. Now, and I felt a presence which I would not have recognized as a 9-year-old with no catechesis as the real presence, the Eucharistic presence. But certainly when I began my journey in earnest towards the church, I recognized immediately that what I was missing was that real presence, and I experienced it in the Catholic Church, and that became the hunger.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, you're right. The Anglican churches are beautiful on the outside, but that's because they got it from us. We built the outside.
Yes.
They're
And
the
they,
ones
they,
that emptied
they
it.
were beautiful on the inside when they had the tabernacle and all the beautiful art, which was whitewashed or destroyed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Also, I know several stories of people who later in life became Catholic, but as children had gone into the church, like this one, Dagny, she's Danish. She was Carl Sundborg's assistant in Vienna. She was a little girl, and she walked into this church, and she had started kneeling down, and she just felt something. And she later became a Carmelite nun.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
It's amazing.
Wow.
Yep.
Which is another good reason to keep our churches open.
Yes.
And to have a tabernacle in the center, and have a light burning,
Yep.
and have stained glass windows. When you go into the church, you realize that there's another world I'm entering here.
And I just love the way Cardinal Ratzinger makes this personal. In this place, the Lord is always waiting for me. That's really so beautiful and so true. And this is what you want to convey to people about your Catholic faith, is that the Lord is calling me and I'm encountering him, and we're in a love relationship together. And I just can't imagine anything more beautiful. Whereas their view of the church is something other than that. Let's just say that.
But again, that's where Chesterton says in Everlasting Man, the two best places to view the church are being inside her at the center or completely outside.
Oh.
If you're on the edges, you don't understand the church, and you're attacking her. And so I think this is symbolically true. Then you want to be able to go into the inside of the church, where the sacrament is. So he concludes this chapter. Again, this is sort of a apology in the good sense of defense of the Middle Ages. And Ratzinger is not one who's nostalgic in the sense of sentimentally attached to the past. He defends the Enlightenment.
Yes, he does.
Not entirely. He recognizes there's errors and problems, especially the de-Hellenization of science and losing the transcendence, which he said in the beautiful address in Regensburg in 2012. But here we see him expressing what is best about the Middle Ages. Bottom of the page 104, that new paragraph, the last line. The changes of the Middle Ages brought losses. Okay. But they also provided a wonderful spiritual deepening. They unfolded the magnitude of the mystery instituted at the Last Supper and enabled it to be experienced with a new fullness. How many saints? Yes, including saints of the love of neighbor, that is the active saints, not the contemplatives, were nourished and led to the Lord by this experience. We must not lose this richness. If the presence of by the way, now this is courteous language. but he's addressing this to people who are taking the tabernacle away. Okay, we must not lose this richness. If the presence of the Lord is to touch us in a concrete way, the tabernacle must also find its proper place in the architecture of our church buildings. Now, people say, "Oh, yeah, but look at St. Peter's. That's the typical church right in Rome. There's no tabernacle with the presence sacrament in the center. It's on the side, the side chapel." Well, that's right. It is. Why is that? Because 10,000 people are walking through every day to visit the place. Most of them not Catholics, at least a lot of them not Catholics, and so those who want to pray can have a place to do so.
It would be almost sacrilegious to have the tabernacle at center in St. Peter's, because for most of the time, most people in there are purely tourists, many of whom have no idea what the Blessed Sacrament is. So you do need to reserve it in if you like, a side tabernacle, which to ensure that it's treated with the reverence and adoration that it warrants, commands, and demands. And so that's exactly correct. In order, in keeping with what Ratzinger's saying here, keeping the Blessed Sacrament in reverence in that situation.
Well, this is a short chapter followed by a long chapter.
So we should probably break.
So why don't we break here, and we'll see all you in the next session on chapter 5, Sacred Time. Thanks for watching or listening. God bless you.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Forum Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at forumbookclub.ignatius.com.